Welcome to the Patron Saints of Pop Culture podcast. I'm Miguel Covarrubias, and I will not be joined by my lovely co-host for a bit as she started becoming rather busy with her amazing bakery business. If you are in the East Cleveland, Ohio area and need baked goods, be sure to check out Home Sweet Bakery on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to review and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. I have a lot of great announcements for you all. First, Patron Saints are back! Obviously. I'll be doing one show a month until next summer. My beautiful co-host may or may not be joining, depending on her workload with the bakery. Which brings me to my next announcement. Our hiatus has brought about my new baby, The Lost Letters. I am so very proud of my new audio drama, and thank you so much if you have listened. If not, there are 2 more episodes to go before all of Season 1 is published, so catch The Lost Letters on your favorite podcast platform. And also review and subscribe if you would like. Now, let's get into it. Let's talk about Netflix's Hollywood. Without Kathy, I'll hold off on the summaries. Well, campy and a bit of what in the world did I start watching in the beginning, the overall work was extremely moving to me. The theme that just one piece could change the world dramatically spoke to my idealistic and hopeful nature. I saw a bit of myself that I didn't have contact with for years in each of these characters. David Cornsweet's naive and heartstrong Jack Costello reminded me of my own silver screen dreams when I was young. Jim Parsons' amazing, against-type Henry Wilson was both slimy but deeply real. He spoke to the dark side of the struggle not to lose oneself while striving for one's dreams. This was mirrored by Joe Mantello's Dick Samuels and the redemption arc that character had over the season, or series rather. Both of these characters resonated so much with how much of that naive self was lost while pursuing my own ministry goals and other goals. Okay, well, one more, and I'll wrap up my review. Patti LuPone's Avis Amberg reminded me of a former therapist so very much, like almost to a T. But overall, I loved it. The show spoke so deeply to me that I had to talk about it, hence the return of Patron Saints. Growing up, I fell in love with the stage and acting. In fact, it was when I felt the most real and the most alive. The irony is not lost on me that I felt the most real when I was wearing another character or a fake identity. This, unfortunately, led to what would become the story of my life. I found that the easiest way for me to hide from all the problems that plagued my life was to retreat into another identity or a mask. We've talked about this a lot before on our previous episodes, but never to the extent of how bad it was for me. I ended up losing who I was. I lost my own identity while hiding in other ones. Now, this is really on display for 2 of the characters I just brought up. For Henry Wilson, who was based on real-life agent Henry Wilson, he lost himself, but used that loss to control and manipulate others. This is something that I think way too many people end up taking this path. They know that what they lost, or realize that they couldn't fully be who they wanted to be, and they ended up using that pain to hurt others. I felt that Jim Parsons showed this pain and lashing out so expertly. I honestly feel like Jim Parsons should never have taken the role of Sheldon Cooper. I feel like he was greatly underutilized as that character, but that's a different story for a different day. Henry stewed in his pain, and it corrupted him. It caused him to hurt others. I really loved the scene near the end where he apologizes to Rock Hudson, who was also based on real-life actor Rock Hudson, though of different real name. The apology showed the hopeful path back from that place of corruption to a place of redemption. The real Henry Wilson never had that moment. The Henry Wilson of our own universe continued to stew until his passing. The corruption continued until late in his life when it developed into a pathological paranoia and addiction. We see in this juxtaposition of the fictional and the real Henry Wilsons the pitfalls of letting the pain of losing oneself and the path to redemption or destruction with how you use that pain. Now, Dick Samuels, who I said was the mirror, for Dick Samuels, who was, as writer Ryan Murphy told Entertainment Weekly, parts of the legendary MGM producer Irving Thalberg, showed how one could be self-aware of the loss of self. In a speech to Rock Hudson about midway through the miniseries, Samuels expresses to Hudson how he knew he was putting himself aside to benefit from the system. He went on to say that each time he went back to the system, he'd lose a bit more of himself, thinking that at some point he'd be able to come back to himself and finally be who he was. In this case, it was his sexuality. And honestly, this speech made me cry because it was so much of myself. I felt like if I gave enough of myself to ministry, there would be some kind of payout one day. This was a lesson I learned the hard way in life. I learned that all deposits in that bank are non-refundable. Anyway, we aren't talking about me. This speech wasn't just a turning point for Hudson, but it was also for Samuels. After this moment, we saw more that he was all in on Meg. He knew that representation was more important and that this was going to be his legacy. He was finally able to let go of the system and just be himself. He had the second full redemption moment in his interaction with Ellen Kincaid. Unfortunately, I feel like that in these two characters, we see the most common paths that people take with an inability to be oneself within a system that is geared towards rich, white, heteronormative, cisgendered males. We see the path that one would take to use that pain to manipulate others, to kind of say, you can't be it because I can't be it. And then you see it in Dick Samuels, who says, okay, just, hide it away while you go and use the system for your own means. But then in each of these, you also see the redemption of that, where in Dick Samuels, you see the idea of coming back to oneself finally. You see in Henry Wilson's, the fictionalized Henry Wilson, that he finally realizes that he hurt people and he tries to make up for it. And I loved that the series ended on a hopeful note. Aside from the tragedies for a few characters, the systems were changed by the movie that the characters had made together. Each of the characters had been changed as well by the movie. This, to me, was such a real representation of theater and acting. Each production that you are a part of changes something. It changes you. It changes the world, even just for one person. And that's the wonderful nature of storytelling. The story changes things. While watching the end, I turned to Kathy and said, I wish we could live in that universe. In fact, I figured out a way of visiting that universe in my own way. I wrote an alternate history short story that will be in the second to last episode of The Lost Letters Season 1. It also helped me to realize that this podcasting was my way of honoring who I really was. I took a different path due to the systems that were in place, but I can still honor the kid who wanted to be in pictures. And speaking of which, I didn't like Jack Costello at first. I think it was because he reminded me too much of who I used to be. Just his being lost so completely in his dream to the detriment of his family and his own life, those destructive patterns are all too familiar to me. I mean that, and his extremely cringy screen test. His change came about through his personal life, when he discovered the truth and how he couldn't help but to be affected by it was his turning point. That's what acting, and in effect what story consumption does. It's a way of allowing the story to teach you something about your own life, letting another world teach you what is important about your own world. That's the reason why I talk about pop culture. I learned so much about myself and my world through all of this pop culture stuff. I just have to share with someone that, even if it's just in a podcast. I think after that moment, while filming Meg, that moment where he just completely blows away the scene, and then he calls for a cut in the middle of it, that I think that moment taught Jack how to be an actor. He learned how to let the story in and then to use himself to tell the story. Now, Raymond Ainsley, Camille Washington, and Archie Coleman all had similar approaches to this. They were all aware of the power of story. In fact, Ainsley's white passing, as Coleman pointed out, was a way for him to bring the story's power to break the system and reform it. I've been learning a lot about systems and replacing. I think it's very much like habits. I recently just determined that I should disconnect majorly from social media. I've learned that unless I replace it with something healthy, I won't succeed in my efforts to be better. This was something that Washington inadvertently alluded to when suggesting the rewrite, though I have to say doing it during sex was a bit underhanded. It was something that Coleman saw when rewriting it. And finally, it was shown to Ainsley through the meeting with Samuels about the ending. Representation is important because it presents an example of how one can break a destructive system and instead replace it with something healthy. For Ainsley, which, by the way, Darren Criss is half Filipino and white passing in reality. Being white passing allowed him to use the systems that were in place to set up a new one. Meg, in that reality, broke the harmful systems of Hollywood and replaced them with something better. We saw this in the hopeful ending, which showed the filming of Wilson's LGBTQ+ love story movie. And I honestly have to say that I loved this. I loved that it ended on a happy note. There are way too many pieces of pop culture that don't end that way anymore. That we see, like, it ends on that lesson note of saying the world is kind of cruddy and crappy and, that's the way we got to live with it. Instead, this one says, no, you can change it. Let's make it better. Let's make it a better place to live. And this is how it's going to play out. Now, granted, it is very idealistic, and it is something that I don't think we really can achieve in most cases, but it's nice to think about. This representation that was portrayed in this unfortunately fictional miniseries is still something that Hollywood in our reality has a difficult time showing. Our systems are still firmly in place, preferring the rich, white, heteronormative, cisgendered male. The fictional version of the 20th Oscar Awards again made me cry because of how representation would have changed our world. The story of Anna May Wong portrayed in the series was very close to our own reality. She never won an Oscar, but was very influential in her acting on the small screen, in television roles. There wasn't a Best Lead or Supporting Actress Oscar awarded to a woman of Asian descent until 1957, given to Miyoshi Umeki. In fact, the first male of Asian descent wasn't until 1956, just the year before, given to Yul Brynner for The King and I. The first director was Ang Lee for Brokeback Mountain. It was worse for black actors. The first Academy Award presented to a black male lead was Sidney Poitier in 1962. And sadly, black women didn't win one until Halle Berry won in 2001. Hattie McDaniel did win in 1939, and her story was very similar to that which was shown on the series. And unfortunately for writers, for a black writer, that didn't happen until just 3 years ago. That was Jordan Peele's Get Out. Hollywood, well, the real one in our reality, has a horrid representation problem. In fact, many of the hurdles that Meg needed to overcome are still in place to this day. I think that Ryan Murphy gave us a very important piece in Hollywood, and we would be wise to learn from this story. I think Hollywood would be wise to learn from Hollywood and use representation. Make it a real thing. Show real characters on the screen. And this is something that can easily be done. There are so many pieces that could have used a little bit more reality. And I think you know which movies, like I refer to when I'm talking about that. There are so many things that have just been whitewashed. And in fact, on social media, this is something that has become quite a big thing. When Oscar So White was a big hashtag. And I mean, this is something that we don't get representation in Hollywood, either on the big screen or on the little screen. There's no real kind of integration into this. It's more tokenism, and rather than a full integration and diversity. So, let's move on to our saints for the series. It's hard for me to pick just one character to name as a saint for the series. I think I'm going to have to name the saints. I'm going to name Saints Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan for giving us this story. I mean, I liked the first series of Glee, but this has very much surpassed Glee in my mind. It still had the same kind of campiness and light feeling that Glee had, but it also, like, Glee didn't have real characters. They were all very caricatures of real characters. There wasn't really anything that was, meaty. It was all kind of like fast food reality. You get what I mean. So anyway, those are the saints I'm going to name for this. I'm going to name Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan for giving us the story. That is the miracle. Because I think this is a great piece of pop culture that I think that we can go back to and say, hey, look, this is a great story for what we need to learn about our own reality and how we need to move forward. So, next month, I'll be talking about The Haunting of Bly Manor. I really enjoyed it, so, spoiler alert for that. But until that time, I want you to be you. It's all you got, and it's all you can be. Bye.